He walked through the wet streets, his footsteps echoing in the empty silence of the night. It kept raining, but he didn't care. Moisture seeped into his clothes, the cold chilling him to the bone. This city had once been home. Now it was just a place he knew, but it had become a stranger. Everything here had somehow changed, and so had he. It doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it feels like he's not the same person he used to be. They used to say that time healed. He believed it. He thought he could survive all these years, this rejection, the loss. He thought he'd come back to his hometown and everything would be like it used to be. Except something was wrong. This place wasn't calling him home anymore. He didn't know what he was waiting for, maybe some kind of forgiveness, maybe an answer to the questions that had been bugging him all these years. He'd always thought he'd come back here when he was successful, when money and fame were no longer important to him, and he was the man everyone had once known. But now he was different. Poor, lonely, hunched over from the bitterness of the past. He didn't believe in miracles, didn't believe in quick fixes. He believed only in the one question that still haunted him: why had she left? The city was like a mirror for him, all his previous mistakes and failures were reflected in every street. And all these streets were familiar, but alien. The familiar houses, all those sidewalks where he had once walked with her, now it all seemed colorless. Why had he come back here? To justify himself? To hear again the voice that had once said, "You are no longer needed"? He didn't know, but the return was inevitable. He had to be here. Because his past still hung over him like an unbearable shadow. As he walked past familiar doors, he tried to imagine what would have happened if he hadn't lost his job then. If he hadn't fallen so low. If he hadn't ceased to be needed. But on these streets, there was no going back. It was just the way it was. He lost his money, but worse, he lost his respect. Respect that once made him feel important. Respect that had gone down the same road as love. Lena. Her name rang in his head like an old scar that never healed. He remembered how they had met in this very city, how his world had been full of expectations and plans. How his eyes burned with ideas and she always stood by his side, beautiful and mysterious. He loved her. And she loved him. Kind of like that. He'd been sure of it until he realized it wasn't him she loved, but what he had to offer her. It wasn't as simple or as beautiful as it seemed. He was someone who could give her security, not just love. He only realized this when it was too late. Poverty was what had happened to him. But poverty isn't just a lack of money. Poverty is the lack of people around. It's the lack of people who understand who you are when you have nothing. When you become nothing, they stop noticing you. When you fall, all you're left with is yourself. He realized that too late. But it's too late for him to come back here now. And what was he waiting for? To find in the old streets an answer that isn't there? He stops in front of an old house that was once his. Or at least it seemed so to him. Everything has changed. Not just him, but also her. He didn't know what to do next. He thought she would meet him with love, but something in himself couldn't believe it anymore. Was she really as he remembered her? Or was it all just his fantasy? Either way, he was here, and he had no more excuses. He found himself back on these streets, among familiar faces, among empty houses and night lights. And now, after all these years, he realized that it was this return that he would have to face. Not the man he had been before, but the man he had become. Because really, all those years were just preparation for the moment when he would have to stand before him and look into the eyes of his lost life. There was only a dark path ahead. But he couldn't turn back now. He thought back to the days when Lena had laughed beside him and the world had seemed a different place. Those memories weren't perfect, but they were happy, albeit with a tang of falseness that now, years later, was becoming more apparent. They had met when anything was possible. When horizons opened up before him, and money and success seemed like natural companions. He was always more confident than ever. He had a plan and knew clearly what he wanted. Then he was someone she admired. Lena wasn't just the woman he shared his nights and dreams with. She was the embodiment of everything that seemed important. Beauty, sophistication, attention to detail. She knew how to be there when needed and disappear when everything went according to plan. There was always a certain lightness to their relationship, even in the most difficult moments. With him, she felt needed, important, even if she didn't realize it herself. They were young, and everything they built seemed certain. They laughed, they made plans. Planned a home, children, a future together. But then he didn't have all the things that later became his life: doubt, pain, despair. He didn't know then that success and career could take so much energy that one could lose meaning. He remembered one time they were sitting on the veranda of their little house, drinking wine, and Lena, with a smile on her face, said, "You'll never regret doing the right thing, will you?" He kept quiet then, because he knew, what mattered to her was not just what he did, but what it brought her. They both loved success, but Lena also realized, he wasn't just her husband. He was someone who could give her everything she dreamed of. But over time, his success began to weigh on her, and money began to seem more important than feelings. It wasn't like that all at once, but gradually. When new projects, ambitions, first misfires began to appear in their lives, he noticed that he didn't find enough fulfillment in it. He began to feel more and more empty. And that emptiness touched Lena as well. She was still as beautiful, well-groomed as ever, but that smile that used to seem genuine was starting to become different. She was no longer looking at him with that look that had once made him strong. That look was now full of expectation, and that expectation was too much. He began to work even harder, setting the goals he was striving for and forgetting that the most important thing was the moment of life itself. He chased after something that could not be grasped. He became obsessed with wealth, status, a sense of power, and didn't notice how mechanical his life became. He could sit in meetings for long hours, solve problems that didn't touch his soul, and feel no satisfaction. But Lena was there for him. That seemed to be everything. But something in him was dying. Then, as his business began to grow and money began to flow in, he began to look at her differently. He noticed how she spent more time on her hair, how her eyes became more interested in the outside world rather than his inner state. She was no longer looking to talk about feelings, she was looking to buy the next brand, a new fur coat, an even more expensive car. Those were her priorities. He didn't say anything, but gradually he began to sense that she wasn't looking for a man in him, but her loyal partner in becoming part of their rich world. His success began to break down their relationship. He stopped seeing her as the girl he once loved. She began to forget him as well. It wasn't that she didn't love him, but the relationship had become part of a game instead of something real. And she couldn't disagree with that. Her gaze became cold as winter, and the words that used to bring comfort now sounded like empty promises. When he looked back, he could no longer find the feeling that had once kept him moving forward, no matter what. Lena was no longer the person he knew. He had become just part of the picture to her. As much a part as his expensive car, as much as their house. Everything was important as long as it got results. But when his business began to fail, when success became slippery and unattainable, when he began to lose his position, something in their relationship collapsed. And it collapsed too. When the money started to go away and the place where he was once a confident leader became threatened, he saw Lena become different. She walked away. She didn't say, "I'm leaving." She just disappeared. Just as his successes disappeared. All their love was gone. He couldn't understand how it had happened, and most importantly why. Why, when everything was good, when everything was in plain sight, had she left so easily? With each year, with each failure, with each disappointment he experienced, his view of those events changed. He saw more and more that there was no real we there. He was needed because he was successful. And when he stopped being successful, her love disappeared. Like everything else. He was trying to get something back. He tried to go back to the place where everything was bright, simple, alive. But back in that city, in those streets, he could no longer find the Lena he had once made his plans with. Nor could he find himself. Now he stood in the empty city and felt that there was no going back. Because the only thing you can bring back is what was actually true. And everything else is just scenery that is beautifully put together as long as there is something to look at. The heroine of his life was gone, as was everything he had known. The business that had once seemed a source of pride was now a ruin. His successes, the very ones that seemed eternal, had evaporated like morning fog. He lost his job, he lost his money, he lost the friends who had been there for him while things were good. But worst of all, he lost himself. When he started to realize that his life had collapsed, it was too late. He tried to save something, tried to go back to the decisions that had once given him confidence, but he could no longer find the strength to go on. He was getting used to the emptiness. And that emptiness poisoned his every step. As he looked at the people who remained, he realized that now he was nothing like the people who had once been on a pedestal, nothing like the one who had been admired. He had become a nobody. And he knew it. Nights he woke up in a cold sweat because he didn't know what awaited him in the morning. He didn't know what he would do, much less why. When everything was in place, he was sure he held his life in his hands. But now that life had become gray, almost impersonal, like an empty office where work had once simmered, like a hotel room he'd entered not to rest but to hide from everything. No purpose, no hope. He was a man with no address, no home, no meaning. And then one day, he woke up and realized that that was it. He no longer had a choice. He must return to his hometown. He must find the answers to the questions that have plagued him all these years. Answers he never gave himself when he was successful. Answers that were hidden in the very places where his life began, where he met Lena, where he made the very mistakes that led to his downfall. He didn't know what he would find. But he felt like he had no more way to go. He got into the car without looking back. The scenery outside the window changed, but his thoughts remained the same. He kept trying to figure out what had really happened. Why, when he was up there, his life seemed perfect, but as soon as he fell, everything disappeared. Where was she? Where were the people who had been hanging words of loyalty and friendship around his ears? He remembered their faces, but they didn't matter now. Everything disappeared so quickly that he barely had time to realize nothing would ever come back. He was a stranger in his native land. As he drove into the city, his heart squeezed. It was the same city, but it was no longer his home. The city was now full of foreign faces. Buildings that once seemed sturdy now looked abandoned. The old stores, the cafes, everything looked like a set from another time. And suddenly he realized that it wasn't the city that had changed. He was the one who had changed. He, the very man who had once owned this whole world, was now part of the void. Now this city was just like him, alien, devoid of life. He drove past the old apartment. It was just as it had been in his memories. Everything was the same as it had been then. Except now he didn't know how to feel. Didn't know what to do. He had expected to see, to feel something that would remind him of his past, that would help him get back to even one bit of who he was. But there was none of that. Just emptiness. He got out of the car, stood under the windows and thought. There was no going back in his life. Everything had been decided long ago. He was a stranger here. And Lena? Where was she? He remembered her face, her smile, her eyes, but now it all seemed a distant illusion. Through the wind that chilled his face, he remembered the days when they had planned the future, built dreams. He was sure it would be exactly as they had dreamed. He'd been sure of it until he started losing. Until he began to lose everything he held dear. Everything that once seemed important had now turned to dust. He walked into the entryway where he had once lived. His footsteps echoed, as if this house no longer knew him. As if he were a stranger here. He took the elevator to the right floor and stood in front of the door, wondering what to do. He didn't know what he would find there. Perhaps she wasn't there anymore. Or she was completely different. Or, she could have been the same. It was hard to imagine. Never before had he felt such a heaviness in his chest. He saw his life in front of him, which had gone so unsuccessfully down the path he'd chosen for himself. And while he had hope in the back of his mind that he would find the answers to everything, he already realized, the answers might not be what he was expecting. This city, these walls, these people, none of it mattered now. He was no longer the man he had known in this place. He was a stranger, and perhaps forever. When the door opened and Lena stood before him, he knew immediately that everything had changed. She had changed too. There wasn't the sparkle in her eyes that had once lit up his world. They were both strangers to each other now. But there was something different in that look, something that made him feel the pain of what he'd lost again. When the door opened, he saw her. Lena. The same Lena who had once been the center of his world. She stood on the doorstep, wearing the same style he remembered, with a slight smile. Everything was almost exactly the same as before. Her hair, her eyes, her habit of raising her eyebrows slightly when something surprised her. Everything looked as if the years hadn't passed, as if he could go back to a time when they were young and full of dreams. But when their gazes met, he knew immediately that she wasn't the same. He noticed a look in her eyes that was somehow alien, as if her thoughts were somewhere else. It wasn't the same gaze that had once been so easy to read. It wasn't just cold, it was something more. The kind of coldness that was hard to hide, as if she was trying to be polite, but her heart was long gone. He felt everything had changed, and it wasn't just his inner feeling. It was in the air, in her every gesture, in her tone, in the way she spoke. She invited him in and he did, but with every step in the apartment he sensed that she was hiding something important. He noticed it in her hands, which trembled as she poured the tea, noticed how her face grew slightly paler when she looked at him, and how for a moment, she looked away as if trying not to show her anxiety. He sat down, and she sat across from him, trying to make conversation like old acquaintances, but there was an insurmountable wall of silence between them. Silent, but so heavy. He could have continued the conversation, asked what had happened over the years, what had changed, but his questions stuck in his throat. He didn't know where to begin. And he didn't know if there was anything to be learned at all. So a few minutes passed like that. Everything was just like old times, but there was also something completely foreign that kept him uneasy. He began to notice things he hadn't paid attention to before. Like the way she avoided his gaze. When their eyes met, she would immediately shift her gaze to the window or the cup in her hands. Or the way she pressed her lips together slightly when he said something about the past. It wasn't the same conversation they'd once had. Everything was set up as if they were both hiding something they didn't dare to talk about. And then, like lightning, came the realization, she wasn't the woman he knew. Everything had changed. He began to realize that their whole life was like a stage on which each of them played a different role. The role of the loving man, the role of the caring woman. But now he saw that underneath those roles were other people. She couldn't be who he remembered her to be. There was no sincerity in her eyes now, no warmth that he had known. He felt his heart clench as he realized that her life wasn't just about the outward glitter she had so carefully crafted, but something much darker. He couldn't figure out what it was, but it was something that hid behind her smile, behind her beautiful words. He sensed she was hiding something important. And the whole time they were talking, her face remained steady, but his eyes, they couldn't hide that emptiness. Lena was no longer the woman who had once greeted him with a blazing gaze and made him believe that their love was all that mattered. Everything had changed, and something in her soul had long since faded away. He didn't know what exactly lurked behind that coldness, behind those masks. But he did know one thing, what he knew of her was now an illusion. He suddenly realized that none of their nights, none of their walks, had been real. Everything that had once seemed important now seemed empty, deceptive, fictitious. Maybe he was part of this game himself, not noticing that her life was going in a different direction. But what exactly was she hiding? That was a question he couldn't forget. Why couldn't Lena look him in the eyes like she used to? Why were her words full of invisible pauses? He sensed that she didn't just want to keep her distance, she was guarding something. Something that wasn't supposed to come out. And he began to realize that her silence wasn't just an attempt to hide her pain. It was something deeper, something she was hiding from everyone, perhaps even from herself. He tried to collect his thoughts, trying to decide what he would do next. He had to figure out what had happened. He had to figure out what she was hiding. But even he himself didn't know what to look for. He had thought he actually knew her, but now it seemed impossible. Everything that had seemed true was shattered. He wasn't just deceived. He had been part of the illusion she had created, and now that the illusion had crumbled, he was left with that feeling, a feeling of emptiness that would not leave him. Then he realized that maybe she wasn't hiding something from him. Perhaps she was hiding something from herself. He sat in the empty room where their life had once been. The very life they had built on success and wealth. Looking out the window at the very street where once every step was full of confidence and meaning. He had been confident then, confident that money, status and power could solve everything. He thought he and Lena were like two halves of the same whole, where his success was her success, where her drive to do better was his drive. But now, sitting in this silence, empty-eyed and thinking, he suddenly realized how far from reality he'd been. All those years of chasing after money, after heights, after power, he had forgotten the most important thing, he hadn't seen Lena. He saw her reflection in his success. He admired her for the way she looked, the way she knew how to be there for him at the right moment, the way she emphasized his accomplishments. But he didn't see what was inside. And now that she was gone, when his successes turned out to be nothing, he realized it had all been a sham. He tried to remember the moments when they had been happy. But now, with each new memory, it became clearer to him, their relationship was more like a deal. He was her opportunity, and she was his face, his jewelry. And they both knew it. Everything that seemed real turned out to be an illusion of their own making. He began to wonder, why had she left? Did she really love him? Or did she love his success, his money, his position? When they'd been together, he'd thought that was exactly what they had, true love, true affection. But now it all seemed a sham. He was no longer someone who could offer her this outside world that had attracted her so much. He remembered the way she used to look at him when he signed important contracts, the way her eyes filled with pride. He thought it was because of him, because of their future. But now that it was all falling apart, he realized, it wasn't pride in him. It was pride in being around someone who could give her everything she wanted. It was pride in a status she considered important. And now that that status was gone, so was she. He tried to figure out where this chasm that separated them began. Was it really all just about the money? Did her feelings depend on how much money he made, what kind of car he drove, what kind of houses he had? Or was there more to it than that? Maybe she too was as lost as he was, in this world where everyone judged another by their looks, by what they could give, by what they had to offer. But the more he thought, the more he realized that her leaving wasn't just about money. It was something deeper. When he looked back on his actions, he realized how his desire to be successful had distracted him from what was really important. He thought that if he had a lot of money, he could protect them both, provide them with a better life, ward off everything bad. But he never thought about what it really took to be close to a man. He thought money could buy love, but he couldn't realize that it was only replacing what should have been in their relationship: trust, sincerity, deep affection. All of that disappeared as soon as his life began to revolve around numbers and balance sheets. He didn't know what to do with that realization now. He tried to find excuses for himself, tried to believe that she just didn't realize what she had lost, that she had left because she couldn't understand that love and attention were more important than all the material goods. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew she was leaving because this world they had built was empty. Their love was based on something superficial, on external trappings that disappeared as soon as their relationship faced reality. He remembered their conversations, those moments when the two of them had sat together, discussing the future. He tried to remember how they had felt then, what they had thought. He remembered her words, how she'd said that happiness wasn't about money, it was about something else. But now that he was alone, he realized that he hadn't just lost money and power. He'd lost her. And at some point, he'd lost himself. All those years he'd tried to keep up with success, to prove to himself and her that he could be worthy. But now what? He was crushed, and his feelings for Lena seemed as empty as everything around him. He could no longer believe in the feelings he had once confidently mistaken for love. He realized that everything was a reaction to her looks, to the way she looked at him when he was successful. But there was nothing real, nothing but empty promises and desires that hid behind the glitter. Now that there was no money, now that there was no success, he realized that he had actually lost more than he could have imagined. He hadn't just lost her. He had lost himself. He didn't know who he was now, what he needed, where to go. He didn't know what true happiness was. In his life, as in Lena's, there was no true love, there was only what they both could give each other while this exchange went on. Now there was only one thing left for him to do: try to find answers. But what answers could be found when everything he believed in turned out to be a lie? They were sitting on the same veranda where it all began. The same house, the same evening when they had talked about the future, made plans, certain that this world was their world. Now that world seemed so distant and foreign. He could feel it in her gaze, in her voice, in the way she was silent when he spoke words that couldn't change anything. They both knew it. They wouldn't go back to that time, wouldn't restore the feelings that had once seemed eternal. Everything was ruined. Lena looked at him, but her eyes lacked the passion, the interest that had once filled their every conversation. She had become a shadow of herself, and he had become a shadow of who he once was. Everything that had been real between them had lost its power. What they thought was the foundation now seemed like sand that had scattered in their hands. And that sand was carried away by the wind, along with their best years, their dreams, their love. Everything they had created was doomed to destruction because they had begun to build it not on real feelings, but on false ideas about themselves and life. He didn't know what to do with what was left. There was room in his heart for regrets, for unanswered questions. He had tried to understand why she had left, but it was clear to him now that her leaving wasn't just the result of him losing money. It was far more complicated and painful. It was a recognition that they both lived in a world they had created for themselves to hide their inner voids. And when that world collapsed, they both realized that they hadn't lost each other because of money. They lost each other because they were hiding their real feelings, their real fears. And those fears were stronger than anything else. He rose from his chair and walked over to the window. The wind was lightly ruffling the curtains, and he felt all this time pass him by. His life, like hers, had been full of events, people, promises, but none of it mattered if there was no truth at the core. He realized that he was just like her. He too had been hiding his true feelings. He had hidden his weakness behind money, behind success, behind this temporary facade. But now, standing here in front of her, he realized, it didn't matter how much money you made, it didn't matter what your accomplishments were, if you weren't living up to what really mattered. She was there for him, but there was a wall between them. It wasn't just silence, but the realization that there was no bringing back what had been. He could have said something, tried to find the words to explain, to take a step towards her, but he knew those words wouldn't change anything. He knew that they each had their own lives now, their own mistakes and their own losses. And most importantly, they both realized that they could not continue in the world they had created for themselves. That world was broken. It had been destroyed long ago, even before they realized it. He looked at her. She was still important to him, but he knew now that he couldn't bring her back, just as he couldn't bring back all that was gone. He realized that this breakup was inevitable. He and she were just walking down the same path, not noticing how everything was crumbling beneath their feet. And now they were both the ones who had to move on, despite all this loss. He turned, took a step towards the door, and for a moment he had the thought that maybe this was all so he could realize that everything he had was an illusion. Everything he had worked so hard to build was not what was supposed to hold him together. He was ready to leave everything behind, her, and this house, and the image of himself he was so proud of. He was ready to move on, not knowing what awaited him. But he knew one thing, if he didn't take that step, he would remain stuck in the past. He looked back at her one last time, but her gaze was no longer the same. She was ready to let him go, just as he was ready to let her go. They both knew they couldn't go back to that world. That world no longer existed for them. And though they both felt pain, they realized that it was the pain of the fact that time could not be brought back, that their past was lost forever. He walked out the door, and the air outside was fresh and cool. He took a deep breath, feeling with each step he let go of everything that was. Everything he once thought was important was now unimportant. He was ready to move forward, not knowing what awaited him beyond the horizon, but knowing for sure that he couldn't stay in the place where everything had begun to crumble. He was leaving, but he wasn't the same man he had been before. He was a different person. And maybe that was the best thing he could do, leave everything behind and start looking for answers in what was left. In the emptiness that was inside of him, but which now seemed less terrifying than the illusions he had lived in all these years. And when he left, there was silence in the air, and the questions that had no answers continued to hang between them.